Hello, folks. This is a quick look at the Scott Odell award winning historical novel Worth with the author, A LaFaye. Here you'll notice that the covers are quite different between the hardcover on the left and the paperback on the right. I'll point out that a big reason for the change between the two is because of the mood on the original cover, pointing out that the mood of that cover looks very eerie and led some people to think it was either a supernatural story or a horror story. And the cover on the right grounds it more in historical fiction and in realism, because on the left hand side there is a soddie on the cover, and the Peel family, who are the central characters of the novel, um, own a wood house, and the young boy in the foreground in the hayfield has blonde hair, and neither of the young main characters in the novel, John Worth and Nate Peel, have blonde hair. So in the paperback cover, you see them racing to stop the fence cutters, and in this version, you notice that the boy in the front has black hair, John Worth, and the boy in the back has brown hair, Nate Peel. Now, one of the things that I did for this novel was a good deal of research on migration to Nebraska. And one of the things you'll quickly notice about this family migrating to Nebraska is that they have brought their world with them. We have the Conestoga wagon in the back, which most of the family usually rides in. And it does not contain much more than their household goods. Their furniture and or farm implements are in the wagon in the front. If you notice, just behind that first wagon, there is a crate with chickens in it. I jokingly refer to this as their KFC on wheels. The only difficulty is that they need to keep some of the chickens for starting their farm, which is also the reason for all of the horses and cattle that you see in this picture, the animals who will help them build their farm once they get to Nebraska. And one very noticeable feature of this landscape is it does not have trees, which makes building a fire for their evening meal a little difficult. And it's not like they can go through a drive-through. So one of the kids you see in this picture will be given the job of that for that day to collect the scat or poop of the animals shown in the picture, which will then be dried out on the back of one of the wagons, so that by the time they stop for a meal, they will have the fuel they need for their fire. Brings all new meaning to hickory smoked barbecue now, doesn't it? Additionally, it's important to note what it's like to live in a Nebraska sod house. You'll notice that these farmers are actually taller than their house. And the reason for that is that sod bricks, which are generally 2 feet by 6 feet, are basically long strips of grass, prairie grass in this case, which looks a lot like straw or hay. And it means that the plants, the roots of those plants is what is holding the dirt together. And so they have to stack them like Legos to create the walls. And because they're 2 feet thick, it's very difficult to create windows. And so often sod houses did not have windows. And they had to be primed on the inside with different products so that the walls would stay intact through the years. And when you think about it, when you first build a sod house, it comes with a lot of issues you wouldn't necessarily think about when building a wood house. For instance, think about what happens when it rains and dirt. You sit down to breakfast and you say, "Ma, I didn't ask for raisins." And they're like, "Those aren't raisins." Because bugs come out of the walls and the ceiling. And it was a dark and short house, because if you get sod walls higher than 5 feet, they generally tend to cave in. They don't retain their structural integrity. Now, one of the other things about Worth is looking into the lifestyle of what it was like to live in a tenement such as where John Worth lived. This is a group of boys staying in an alleyway and a young girl in the front there, between two tenement buildings. And we know that this is after the 1870s because there's actually a fire escape above the boys. And those didn't exist until the 1870s. And I'd like to point out that because of the lack of knowledge of tensile strength in steel, oftentimes the early fire escapes did not stay attached to the building when many people went onto them to try and escape fires. They frequently came right off the building. And you'll notice that these tenements frequently would be a very small apartment. There'd be a central room where you would have the stove and where people ate and where people gathered in the evening. They generally did not have what we refer to now as a living room. And they frequently had the bed of the parents in that room. For many people, that was the extent of their apartment. Most people did not have a second bedroom. In order to pay the rent, some people would rent out space on their floor in shifts. So if you had a factory shift that ended at 8, then you'd come and sleep for 8 hours and then get up and go back to work. And you'd pay for that spot on the floor. So sometimes there would be as many as 20 people in a single apartment. And they very frequently did not have adequate exit points for a fire. We talked about the fire escapes already. There was often only one staircase per floor. If they were lucky, there were 2, but they were usually only about 3 or 3.5 feet wide, which made it difficult for multiple people to go down the stairway at the same time. The orphan train riders, such as these shown in this picture, were frequently sent on the train in wool clothing that was 2 sizes too big because the people who sent them on the orphan train wanted them to make sure they had warm clothes in winter, because they really did not track where the kids went, nor did they often check up on them after the first year. Additionally, it's important to note that 2 of the most frequent conductors on the orphan train, which was not a singular train, but any train these societies used to transport orphans. Between 1876 and 1930, over 150,000 children were brought on the orphan train out into the West. Loring Brace was the last name of the preacher who started the Children's Aid Society of New York City. He built a building for children who were living on the streets, and the beds filled within 30 days with a 2-year waiting list. So he realized he needed to do something more to help the orphans of New York City. I'd like to point out that many of them were not actually orphans, but had been abandoned at the Children's Aid Society because their parents couldn't pay for them, because they lost a job, or one of the parents died and the other parent didn't know how to take care of the children and work. It's also important to note that in this time period, children in most families, up until the Great Depression, the work that they did allowed the family to make 40% of their income every month. So children working was the common way of life up until the 19th century, when education became mandatory. And it took many decades before most families were able to send their kids to school on a regular basis. And so that gives you a quick overview of the elements of the historical background of Worth. I will point out that the other main society for bringing orphans out into the West is a Catholic-run charity in New York City. So thank you for listening, and if you have any further questions, feel free to email me at a@alafaye.com. Thank you. Bye.